And this is an amazing assemblage of people, and I'm truly honored to be here. Show of hands, how many were several of us at the table where I was eating a few minutes ago? How many of us were here in 2010 in California for the core conference? All right, there are 6 or 8 in the room. Excellent. Well, it's nice to be part of a group. I'm going to be talking about that in just a moment in several different contexts. But it's nice to be part of a select group, and that's what you all are. And so it's really terrific to be here as part of that group. So why this topic? Why if I only had a brain? Well, before I get very far into it, I'm going to pick on Matt for a moment. Imagine we're at work. Stand up if you would, Matt. Imagine we're at work, and I walk up to Matt and I say, you know, that meeting last week, you made a couple of comments. Can I give you some feedback? So I'm just going to stop there. How do you feel at that moment? When somebody walks up and says something like that, what's it make you feel?
Anxiety, nerves.
Yeah.
I feel it here.
Yeah.
Some people feel it out here. But...
Yeah. Does it make you maybe we should close that door? Does it make you want to leave the room? It might. A comment like that. Yesterday, and thank you, Matt. Yesterday in the lobby of the hotel, just down the hall here, I was standing there, and there was this guy in a t-shirt in front of me, and he was talking to the hotel staff, and I overheard him say something about, well, I'm looking for this box of my clothes because I'm about to go to Orange Theory Fitness. Now, I happen to belong to Orange Theory Fitness too, and that was my plan for yesterday afternoon. So lo and behold, Bob Flisser and I ended up at the same Orange Theory Fitness place working out yesterday afternoon. Well, I discovered something rather interesting. This guy is a beast. I mean, I'm reasonably fit especially perhaps for my age, but this guy in the last 5 years, he's been to Orange Theory Fitness to work out 1,500 times, and his goal by the end of 2024 is 500 more to round out 2,000. I mean, that's impressive, right? So once again, I'm just going to pause. I'm using this as an example. How does it feel to have somebody make a comment like that about you in public? Pretty good. Yeah, you'll take it, right? Those are the kinds of things I want to talk about as we explore our brains. So, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear that phrase? Yeah, right? So, the Scarecrow wandered through Oz with Dorothy and others looking for a brain. Well, that's relevant to my topic today, but it's also relevant because the guy in that picture on the right is me playing Scarecrow in a musical production of Wizard of Oz in 2004. And the amazing part for me is the girl, Dorothy, to my right in the picture is my daughter, my younger daughter, Julie. Now, talk about fatherhood, ultimate fatherhood experiences. I mean, Dorothy and the Scarecrow are on stage for like 75% of the time together, right? And then there's that moment at the end where she turns and she says goodbye to the lion and goodbye to the Tin Man. And then she turns to the Scarecrow and she says, and you were always my favorite. God, the tears were real. There was no acting involved there. It was real. This was a real cool thing for me. Well, Julie, my daughter, is going to re-enter the stage here in just a second. What I want to talk about for the first part of this presentation is some ideas from this book written by a guy named David Rock. Now, I happened to hear him speak at an event, was intrigued, bought a copy of the book at about the time that Julie, my daughter, was in her undergraduate program. She ended up with a degree, a bachelor's of science in cognitive neuroscience, right? So from Dorothy, from Oz to neuroscience, right? I read this book while she was in school, and I gave her a copy, and I said, you know, I'd be interested to know what you think. She read it. She gave it back to me, and she said, Dad, I really wanted to hate this book. I really wanted it to just be pop neuroscience and nothing that was real. But this guy knows what he's talking about. Well, David Rock, as he says right at the beginning of the book, is not a neuroscientist. He's actually a consultant who works with organizations to help increase employee productivity. But what he discovered early on is that by talking to several people he knew who were neuroscientists and then expanding his community even farther, that the more people knew about how our brains operate, the more we all know about how our brains operate, the more effectively we can work together. Your brain, my brain, all of our brains try really hard to do two things. We try to minimize danger and maximize reward. That's just what's going on up there all the time. So back in the more ancient times, early humanoids, danger was always physical, right? There were tigers, there were lions and bears, oh my, right? There were things that caused us to want to run away. And so the brain reacts by going out the door. Or if we see something attractive, something that looks good, our brains react by sending us toward that thing. So it's these away and toward reactions that are critical. And what's really important in David Rock's book is that the things that cause physical pain, physical triggers, the lions and the cookies, cause the same reactions, the same set of neurons that fire the same chemical actions in the brain as social interactions. How many of you walked into the room last night and were really completely comfortable? Couple of you, great. That's wonderful. But you notice how few that was out of all of us here? Most of us find stranger danger, if you will, or find danger in odd, in groups of people that we haven't been part of before. So it's key, it's really helpful as we all work together to appreciate that the things that we say can cause the same physical reactions as actual physical objects. So when I said to Matt, can I give you some feedback? He talked about anxiety, and he even said, and I feel it here. Well, that's absolutely true. We all react in those ways. So one of the things I like about David Rock's book is he talks about, he organizes his thoughts around something he calls the SCARF model. And SCARF in this case is an acronym for these 5 things. Our brains crave these things all the time. We want to have status. We want to be certain about things. We want to feel like we're in control. We want that sense of autonomy. We want to be part of something. We want to be related to each other in some way. And we want life to be fair. Now, that last one is hard. We all get disappointed at times. In fact, we all get disappointed in all these areas. And I just want to talk about a couple of, or each of them for a moment. So in terms of status, changes in status have a very profound effect on us, much the same way that a physical object that causes us to be frightened or causes us to want to move toward it does. So we need to appreciate the fact that when our status changes, then we need to appreciate what effect that has on others, and that when someone else's status changes in some way, what effect it has on us. Interestingly, we all immediately size each other up, whether we're doing this consciously or not. So when we were walking around the room last night, we're walking around introducing each other, ourselves to each other. Some of us knew a few people in the room, not everybody did, but your brain is saying, okay, how do I compare to this guy? And I freely admit, I feel like a fake in this room in particular, and I felt the same way in 2010 at the core conference, because I described myself then as a one-trick pony, and that's really kind of true. I do Visio, and I do some other office stuff too. In terms of my contributions to Experts Exchange, I've just answered some questions, write some articles. I've never done all of the hard work that most of you do as moderators and page editors and so forth. I truly appreciate all of that work that you do, but it makes me feel like, oh my God, do I really belong here? And so that's a real thing for us. Even as confident as I may seem and appear in front of an audience, I'm walking around last night thinking, oh, I know what she does, I know what he does, and I don't do that. So be aware of that reaction that you might be causing in other people quite inadvertently. I've made that point already. Let's talk about what are some of the things that might threaten your status. For example, being wrong in public, right? That's a biggie, right? you answer something or you make a comment and you get shot down, that does not feel good. And that's, again, one of those things that can cause that your stomach to react or cause that tightness in Matt's chest, for example. How about, I didn't used to have election on this bullet. Can't think why I might have added that, but we won't go there. But being wrong or losing something, you losing status in public is significant. There's that, can I give you some feedback? Things that affect our status positively, getting promoted, being added to a team, getting positive feedback. So, my comment to Bob was legitimate, by the way, and everything I said about him is true, but I did it deliberately to make a point that kind of positive feedback can really be significant to somebody, especially when it's unexpected, right? If you compliment someone and it's completely out of the blue, and you're sincere, that's important, it can have a really profound effect on someone's day. I'm sure that's happened to all of you. Somebody says something unexpectedly, and it's significant. Back to Orange Theory for just a second. In June, I was at a conference in Fort Lauderdale, and I did the same thing Bob and I did yesterday. I went to a local Orange Theory, and I'm on the rowing machine, and I'm the stranger in the room. Most Orange Theories, it's all people who are there very regularly. I'm the stranger in the room. Everybody knows there's a visitor. And then the coach, who's got a lav mic like this, she comes on the speaker and she says, if y'all just look down at rower number 1, our visitor, Scott, that's textbook form. He must have been on a rowing team. Nope, never been on a rowing team. I just had some good coaches at the the Orange Theory near me. But how did I feel at that moment? I'm getting singled out in a group of strangers for having good rowing form. Okay, it worked. I felt pretty good that day. So, certainty. Our brains like when we know what's going to happen. We like to be able to predict. Now, some of us are better at surprises than others. Some people like surprises, some people don't. But at the base level, our brains crave certainty. We really like to know, we know the tide's going to come in twice a day. That's a good thing. And if you live near the ocean, that's important to be able to appreciate. We like to be able to find things that are familiar. We like to be able to understand what's going to happen. And by the way, this describes my wife. This a bit about surprise parties. I discovered very early in our relationship that was never going to happen. I did once give her a very small surprise party. 3 or 4 friends came over. It has not happened since, and it never will. She's just not a surprise person. So what kinds of threats, what might threaten your sense of certainty? Starting a new job, being in a new situation, being in that room full of strangers last night or another time. Those are things that can cause that physical uncertainty, the physical feelings in our heads and in our bodies. Rewards. What sort of things? I mean, you give me some ideas. What sort of things are likely to help your sense of certainty? What's going to make you think, oh yeah, that's good. I predicted that, or I feel good that happened. Anything? What's that? Yeah. So if you think you've done a good job and somebody compliments you about that good job, by golly, you were right. You thought you did a good job. Somebody else thought you did a good job. That feels good because that enhances your sense of certainty. Setting a goal and meeting that goal. Bob's got this ambitious goal of 2,000 visits to Orange Theory by the end of next year. I kind of think he's going to get there. By the way, do the math. How many weeks are left? 60 or 70 weeks between now and the end of 2024? 500 visits? Yeah, okay. How about this one? How many of you have written code ever? Yeah, I think that's a fair percentage of us in the room. How often do you think, I got this. I nailed this. I'm going to run this code for the first time. It's going to work. Well, when it does,
Shock.
Yeah, shock may happen, but the first one, what? Oh, it runs the first. There you go, first time. Thank you. I hadn't noticed it was back there. On the other hand, yeah, so your sense of certainty might be threatened a little bit if it doesn't work. I don't know about you, but I've had those moments where my head's on my desk because I just knew it was going to work, right? Yeah, not so much. Let's talk about autonomy, the A in SCARF. So autonomy has to do with us being in charge. What's interesting from a neurological standpoint is that being in charge and feeling like you're in charge actually are almost the same thing to your brain. So if you're working with a team and you can help people appreciate that they have a say in what's going on, that they are in charge or in charge of parts of the project or parts of the team, that's pretty significant. That has a lot to do with their sense of well-being, and you're feeding the autonomy parts of their brain. So threats, if we're being micromanaged, how does that feel, right? Anybody ever worked for somebody who was constantly, just looking over your shoulder, seeing what you're doing? Yeah, you've been there and done that. Well, don't do that. You might have been there, but don't do that. Don't be that micromanager, because that is absolutely positively going to threaten someone's sense of autonomy. And that part of their brain is always going to be firing jagged bullets because, jagged lightning bolts, because you're impeding their ability to feel autonomy. Needing multiple sign-offs, being forced to change. You walk into a situation at work and somebody says, well, we're not doing it that way anymore. We're now doing this instead. Well, did you ask me? Was I consulted? No, probably not. So think about those kinds of things as you're interacting with your teams. What sort of rewards might there be for autonomy? Anybody? What would make your brain feel good about a situation? Yeah, if you can just take it on, do it yourself, take responsibility for something. Yeah. Pardon me? Yeah, taking initiative. Yeah. So those are all good, positive things, rewards, freedom to choose, taking responsibility. The middle bullet there on the right, being in control or having the feeling that you're in control. Remember that your brain reacts almost as positively to thinking you're in charge or thinking you have control as actually having control. I find that fascinating. Let's talk about relatedness. So this is the being part of a community, the very reason why we are all here. Neurologically, it's as important to your health, to your well-being rather, as health and money. Now, I'm going to be really happy with some health and with some money, but it turns out that feeling part of a community, being part of a community, is just as important to our well-being. So we've got, let me just back up to this one for a moment. When we meet people, your brain is subconsciously classifying them as friend or foe. It's that away and toward responses again in the brain. The idea here is to recognize that that's what's going on in your head. So when you meet somebody and you're sort of doing a status check and you're also checking on their, subconsciously you're thinking, is this somebody I can trust or not? Be aware that that's going on, and be aware that that's going on in the person you're interacting with as well. And maybe you can come up with a comment or an idea or lead a conversation that helps people feel more comfortable. I don't know about you, but there have been people I've worked with over the years whose opinions I truly didn't care about. Not many, but there have been some, and I can tell by the smiles on your faces, some of you have been in those positions too. I would love to be that person who can treat Matt's opinion, and he's one of the people I would consider friend, not foe, but I would like to say that I'm the person who can treat Matt's opinion as equally as Peter Waxman, a guy I used to work with decades ago who I never figured out. But I didn't. I pretty much rejected everything Peter ever said to me because it was all wrong. Was it wrong? I don't know. But it felt wrong because of the way I felt about him. So what threatens our sense of relatedness? Certainly being rejected, being told no. As a theater geek, auditions are a real thing, a real challenge, because you go to an audition to be in a theater production knowing full well that most people won't be cast, and most people will not be cast in the role that they might have had their eye on. So you're setting yourself up for rejection by design. And it's actually a great lesson for children. I mean, my daughters were the ones who got me back involved in theater about 20 plus years ago. And I really thought it was a good thing that they had done that for me. Well, it was a good thing because I've enjoyed it ever since. But it was important for them too to realize that sometimes the director's looking for a particular persona, and that happens not to be you. It doesn't mean you're not talented. It doesn't mean you have other skills, but you have to recognize that in this situation, it's a different story. So same idea for us at work. It's a no or a rejection is not automatically a bad thing, but it still fires those parts of your brain that say, oh my God, I've just been threatened, and I'm not part of this community, part of this group. Foe-like behavior from a friend. Now there's a big one. If there's going to be something that's going to cause a visceral reaction in me, it's somebody that I think is my friend who's suddenly exhibiting behavior that is not friend-like. And the opposite can be true too. Someone who is in the foe category who makes an approach to you in a positive way, or if you believe someone thinks of you as in that foe category, if you can make a sincere and positive approach to them, you may be able to change that landscape entirely. And just by talking a little bit, by making a couple of comments. So being invited to join, being asked to come here, this is a positive thing for all of us. It enhances our sense of relatedness. And the last bullet there, being in the room where it happens. How many of you have seen Hamilton? One of the finest pieces of musical theater in the last 25 years. Stunning piece of work. Well, Aaron Burr was never in the room where it happened. And it got to the point where, for those non-US folks in the room, Aaron Burr had a duel with Alexander Hamilton, who's the main subject of the musical Hamilton, and challenges him to a duel and actually kills him. So it was sufficient for Alexander Hamilton to accept the duel because of his honor, but it was Aaron Burr who challenged him in the first place because he felt like everything happened around him. He was never invited to the party. He was never in on the really critical conversations about the founding of the US. So, fairness. Fairly straightforward here. This is, interestingly, being treated well, being treated equally is as significant as being part of a community as many of the other things we've talked about here. So threats, what do we feel like it can make us really ill to feel like we've been cheated or we've been treated unfairly or treated differently. Betrayal by someone close to you, again, even stronger reaction for most of us, much like an unexpected compliment can make us feel really good. Unexpected treatment by somebody we care about can make us feel badly. And by the way, one of the things I try very hard to do as I think about David Rock and his book, and it's called Your Brain at Work, this is all going on at home too. And I would love to tell you I'm a better spouse because I embrace these principles in my life at home, and I still have a long way to go. Rewards, fairness rewards, being treated in public, being recognized in public as being equal, and so forth. So I think you have a sense here for what this SCARF model is all about. I try to keep it in mind all the time, both work and home, as I've mentioned, because there are some really valuable ideas here to think about. Any questions or comments so far? Yes?
In the previous slide, I think on your second bullet, you said some of the food.
Oh, yeah.
Can you elaborate on food?
It's in the back of the room if you, okay. Yeah, the notion here is that your brain reacts as strongly to being treated unfairly or being welcomed and treated equally as the physical reactions in the body are much the same as satisfying a need for food. So hunger drives people in different directions. I don't want to keep picking on my wife here, but on the other hand, she's 1,000 miles away, so I guess I can get away with it. She's one of those people who, for whom hangry, hunger, angry, for whom hangry was invented. When she hasn't had enough food, it shows up, and it's a challenge at times. So the good news for her is that she can satisfy that with food, and we can help people around us at almost the same level neurologically by ensuring that we're treating them fairly. We have the time here. Okay, good. So next, second half, if you will, is some other ideas about the brain from this gentleman named Ned Herman, who's the co-author here. Anne is his daughter. Ned is deceased. His daughter and her husband run the company that surrounds this set of ideas. Ned Herman was a brain researcher. So unlike David Roth, not a neurologist, this guy is a neuroscientist, right? His research in the 1990s and early 2000s led him, I'm sorry, earlier than that, in the 80s and into the 90s, led him to publish the first edition of this book in the mid-90s. And his idea was based around a diagram here that I'll explain in just a second. It has to do with thinking styles. Before I get there, how many of you have taken the, I just went blank, the personality, Briggs-Myers. How many of you are familiar with Myers-Briggs or Briggs-Myers? It's a way to assess people's personalities, and you end up with a 4-letter acronym that describes whether you're an introvert, an extrovert, and a variety of other things. That's a very commonly used way to look at individuals and groups of people to help people relate to each other more effectively by appreciating the differences in personality and personality types. This is not that. The idea is somewhat the same in that his research led him to recognize that there were 4 very different contrasting styles of thinking that different people use. And so let me walk around the circle here with you as I describe the 4 thinking styles, and then we'll use that going forward. So in the A quadrant, and stop me if this is going to sound like some of you self-assessing here and thinking, oh, maybe I'm an A thinker, right? A thinkers tend to be very logical, driven by data, driven by facts. In fact, a one-word summary for this thinking style would be, just the facts, ma'am, for those of you U.S. citizens who remember an old TV show for which that was a catchphrase. I don't even remember what the show was. Dragnet. Thank you. Dragnet. Yeah. Wow. There's somebody here almost as old as me. So A thinkers tend to view the world that way. B thinkers tend to be the folks who make lists and agendas and like to organize and plan things. They're people who may tend to be a little bit more conservative. They're not the ones who are going to jump on new ideas necessarily. So organized is a good description for folks in this category. This, by the way, is my wife. I've come to appreciate even more over the years. I always knew she made lists all the time. I do sometimes too, but she's the one with the agenda for the weekend. She's the one who organizes meals. I do most of the cooking, but I love having somebody who does most of the shopping and the meal planning and prep. I can cook anything when I'm supplied with ingredients. It's great. So B thinkers tend to view the world through that set of lens, that organized, focused, agenda-driven style. People whose thinking is predominantly in the C quadrant are those who focus on interpersonal skills. It's the emotional interactions. If I do this, how will you react is a key motivator for people whose thinking style is in the C quadrant. Interestingly, musical and like to teach. These are properties that tend to be stronger in people who are C-type thinkers. And then there are those in the D quadrant whose thinking mostly revolves around creating and starting new things and conceptualizing, synthesizing ideas. These are the folks who are the creatives. Now I'm going to go around the circle one more time before I talk about how many people tend to be in different quadrants, and then I'll actually give you a quick self-assessment here. But let's talk about the A thinkers one more time. You see some characteristics up here. Again, just the facts, ma'am, is a good summary, a good catchphrase. People who are predominantly A thinkers may not pay as much attention to human factors or personal interactions as people who are dominant thinkers of a different style. In the B quadrant, we have people who may appear a little bit like control freaks because perhaps they are, but they're controlling, they're organized, they like to make sure that things are going to happen according to a plan. The C thinkers are the ones who are reading the room. They're the ones who can see that, oh, that whole side of the room is looking out the window. It must be something I'm doing. So these are the people who are good at relating to other people, who recognize that being sensitive is a positive thing. And there's nothing wrong with being sensitive to others and what's going on around. The D thinkers, on the other hand, are those who may live in a cloud. And I don't mean a cloud like most of us deal with, but whose head is often in the clouds because they're thinking outside the box. They may not even know there is a box. It's that kind of thing, right? So people like this, great. They may speak in metaphors. You're never quite completely certain what they're saying because that's just the way their brains work. So what does all this mean? Well, if we look at the population of the world, it turns out that there are about 5% of people whose thinking is thoroughly dominated by one of these four styles. So that's only 20% of the planet. 5% dominated by one of those four quadrants. There are only 5% of people who are truly whole brain. And part of what Herman tries to get across in his book many times is that whole brain thinking is the ideal. And there are only 5% of people who truly are whole brain thinkers. The rest of us, we just do what we do, right? We're out there, we may have dominant in A and D, or maybe B and C, or B, C, D, whatever the case might be. Most of us have a blend of thinking styles. If you look at the population of 100, or take a sample of 100 people, it turns out that that's a good number. Anything more than that, you're almost guaranteed to have a team that it can exercise whole brain thinking. So 100 people is sufficient to have a group that can ensure that we're going to be thinking with all of the styles and all of the parts of our brain. If you look at ethnic groups, there are virtually no measurable differences. There is a total of approaching 1 million people who have been surveyed, have taken the Herman Brain Dominance Instrument, it's called, the HBDI. 800, 900,000 people who've taken this survey. So they have pretty decent statistical basis for making claims like this. How about this one? Let's talk about men versus women. Let's start with women. If you were to guess whether there's a slight trend in one quadrant or another for women, what would you guess? B, C. It turns out there's a slight skew towards C. There's a little bit more of the emotional and interpersonal. And again, this is the statistical results of his 800,000 people plus who've been surveyed. And what about us guys in the room? Where do you think we tend to, yeah, everybody's pointing at A, right? I've done this presentation at, well, actually, I'll hold this thought until we get a little further. So yeah, there are differences, and that's wonderful. It also means that we should be able to embrace those slight differences in focus and be able to use them to our advantage. And I'll talk more about that just before I wrap up. Let's think for a moment about your preferences, that is, your thinking style preferences. And I've drawn an arbitrary one here on the screen, that dashed parallelogram. This is a person who tends to think creatively. Interpersonal, emotional component is high as well. They do some rational, organizing, data-oriented thinking also. But let's say that this person happens to have a job that requires this. It requires a stronger A and B component. Does that mean that person is unfit for this job? Not at all. What it means is that if this is you, if you're the one with the C and D thinking styles and your job requires more A and B thinking, what you probably need to do is consciously reduce your need or your desire to exercise creative control. You may need to push your boundaries a little bit to accept that an agenda and a plan is a good thing for the benefit of the team. You may need to pull back a little bit on your emotional reactions to things, or your need to reach out to people and ask how they're doing and so forth. And you may need to push in the direction of saying, okay, I need more data. I recognize that this team needs more data, more facts, more analysis in order to achieve our goal. Same idea here in terms of your thinking preferences versus your competencies. This one is interesting. So I just posited the same starting point. Somebody whose thinking is mostly skewed toward the C and the D quadrants over on the right. What if that person also happens to be really good at doing the data and organizing things? There's nothing wrong with this. It's just that some of us are good at doing things that are less in our comfort zone, that require a little bit more conscious thinking to say, I need to do this, I need to make this move in this direction instead of what I want to do inherently. So your thinking styles don't need to dominate your life, but it's important to recognize what they are, and equally important to recognize what they are among your colleagues or your family, and try to work a balance. What does this have to do with teams and communication among teams? Well, it turns out that if you build a team of people who mostly all think the same way, that is, they're all A's or B's or C's or whatever, if that's the dominant thinking style of everyone on the team, they're going to work together really well. They're going to achieve results fairly quickly. But guess what? They'll probably be suboptimal results. It's almost too easy because everybody thought the same way, so everybody said, sure, this is a great solution. Whereas if you have a team of people with 3 or 4 thinking styles, it may take them a little longer to get started. They may struggle a bit to find out how to work together, but guess what? They're going to achieve better results. It will be a more positive outcome. And for those of you who like to think graphically rather than with a bunch of words on a slide, this is the idea. The heterogeneous team with multiple thinking styles is likely to take a little longer, but achieve a better result. So what does that mean if you're building teams? Well, I'll give you a chance to answer that question in a moment. But first, point your phone at the QR code or go to menti.com and enter those 8 characters, 8 digits. This is your chance to do a completely non-scientific self-assessment of your thinking style. And when I say non-scientific, I finally had a chance to take the HBDI a couple of months ago, and it's a series of about 60 or 70 questions that try to get your sense of this versus that. and create a profile. And Dave, if you'd switch over. There we go. So you're already answering. This is Mentimeter is the polling system that I love. It lets me do things like this live with an audience. So what do you think, based on the questions that I've asked you, the sliders I've asked you to move around, what do you think are your dominant thinking styles? And then we'll get an assessment of what this room looks like. And we're already starting to see that a dominance that we sort of predicted a little bit ago when I asked the men in the room what they thought their thinking style or thinking preference was probably like. So I can't see the number down here. We got, oops, that's under your, any chance you can clear that, that pop-up? I just want to see whether there's a number underneath that shows me how many responses there are. That's all right. We're close enough. So what do we have here? We have a room full of people who believe, based on this unscientific self-assessment, who believe that they are data-driven, not a big surprise, who have sort of halfway in the B quadrant, 2.8 out of 5. So this room thinks that they have thinking styles that are comfortable with being organized and being the person to create the agenda and run the meeting. The interpersonal skills are about the same, slightly higher, probably not statistically significant, 1/10 of a point difference. But there are lots of folks in the room who recognize that they have some of that emotional intelligence, some of that ability to read the room and react appropriately. And then slightly stronger in the D quadrant, so 3.2. So there are folks in the room who believe that their thinking includes the ability to think outside the box, to be creative, to synthesize a bunch of ideas, to create new things. So does this sound, look reasonable? Anybody who feels like they're an outlier as compared to that? Maybe you don't want to admit that, because then, you know, that will affect your sense of status in the room, right? We don't want to go there. But yeah, so I find this absolutely fascinating, and there's a lot of value to things like the Myers-Briggs for personality assessment. But I really enjoy this idea that we can learn more about our brains and be more effective. So thank you. Back to the slides. I've just got a couple of suggestions to wrap up, to tie some of the toward and away and scarf ideas and some of these Herman brain instrument ideas together. When you are part of a team, think about the thinking styles of you and the other members of the team. If you're leading a team, strive to be approaching that 5% of people who have whole brain ability, so that you can be not only a leader of the whole brain thinking, but that you are capable of recognizing that you need to assemble teams of people who are capable of whole brain thinking. So get those diverse thinking styles in one place. Quick test here. So we need somebody on our team who is accountable and factual. Which thinking style is that? Yeah, sounds like A. Goal-oriented. I'm making this easy. They're in alphabetical order on this slide. Yeah. Somebody with respect for individuals. Yeah, it's that C quadrant thinking style that we want. And somebody who's imaginative is the D style. So again, as you're assembling a team, be conscious of the fact that people are approaching whatever you're talking about differently. So here, if we're going to do a presentation to a customer, and we need somebody to help set the stage, to create the big picture view of what we're trying to accomplish, which thinking style is that, probably? D? I'd go with that. That's, whoops. Sorry, I forgot my slide build order. So these are the characteristics of what we want to accomplish for our customer presentation. And yeah, that first one is going to be somebody who's the creative person who can help see the big picture and move us in that general direction. If we want to provide data and facts, sure, we're going to find somebody who's on the A style, and similarly for the other two. So you get the idea here. Think about the people in the room people in the team you're assembling. One of the things Herman found in his research is that it's very common that people say to themselves, oh, we don't have enough people. We can't create a whole brain team because there just aren't enough people in this organization. Well, again, remember from before, if there are 100 people that you have as a pool from which to draw, I'm not suggesting that the teams should all be 100 people. That would be awkward at best. But if you have 100 people in a pool from which you can draw, then your chances of building a more whole brain team are much, much better. And remember, this business about the way men and women think being slightly different, Herman goes so far as to say it is not possible to have optimal results unless you have a mix of gender on the team. You need to have those style differences to create truly effective teams. And he also suggests that rather than focus on, when you're putting a team together, rather than focus on job roles or titles, think about thinking styles instead. And instead, what sort of people do we need to bring to bear on this business problem we're trying to solve? And if you have that flexibility, then go with that instead of just looking at titles. Remember that in the SCARF idea of things, the toward and away responses, remember that social cues, conversation, words can cause just as physical a sense of pain or discomfort as physical objects or actions. Interestingly, according to David Rock's research, the pain caused by social cues lasts far longer than physical pain. I don't know, have anybody ever had a broken leg? Broken arm? Yeah. Was it painful? Do you sit around thinking about how painful it was 5 years later? The physical pain that we experience can be intense, but generally, you write it off after some period of time. How many of you still remember an insult from college or high school? There are those things that some of us are a little closer to a high school than others of us. I'm looking at you, Destiny, but but it is true that the social pain that we have felt over our lives can last a really long time. So do what you can to mitigate that or to prevent it from happening in the first place if you're in a situation with some control. I like this point. The brain always tries to deal with threats first. So the away response is a bit more dominant than the toward response. So if you're setting up a situation, try to do it in a way that reduces the threats so that people don't have to be concerned with blocking those out or confronting or dealing with those. They can focus instead on the rewards. Actually, I have one more thought about that comment I'll make in a minute. If you are doing a presentation, consider your audience. And we're always told that. Anybody who's ever presented in front of an audience, part of the coaching you might get from a mentor or from a friend is, think about the audience. What is it they need to hear? I can talk all day about things I care about, but if the audience doesn't care, then who cares? So think about the thinking styles of your audience. If you have an audience like this with dominantly A thinkers, then a presentation that focuses on the data and the facts and how we got there and the analysis we did is likely to be a winner. If you're talking to an A thinking style audience about their emotional sense of well-being, that's going to be a bigger challenge. So think about the B thinkers and the C and the D thinkers. What is it that triggers positive reactions in their brain, the reward, the toward mechanisms? Try to organize your presentation in a way that lets you address those things in your audience. Same thing when you're teaching. There's a lot of educational theory about learning styles and so forth. This is related to that, but I'm not an expert in that by any means, but think again about your audience. What is it that's going to get the learners in the room attracted to the things that you're saying? If they're A thinkers, it's one set of ideas. If it's the B or the C or the D thinkers, then you may need to frame the same idea a little bit differently. Use some examples, use some stories, do some some brainstorming with the students in the room so that everybody has a better taste of being involved. And same idea with making decisions. I'm just going to go past this one very quickly, except for one point, this last one here. Herman found that, and I envy those of you who are capable of, in many cases in this room, speaking or being fluent in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 languages. I'm unfortunately an ignorant American, and my Russian that I used to know 40 years ago is non-existent. But Herman found that people who are capable of thinking in a different language arrived at better decisions because that forced them out of their comfort zone and into a different brain space that helped them achieve a better result. So I think this is the point I wanted to come back to. If you're setting up a meeting, if you're working on in a business situation, and if you can eliminate the threats or reduce the threats, perhaps by calling the meeting not to address a problem, to solve a problem, but rather to achieve an outcome, that helps trigger the toward responses in people's brains. If you're call the meeting and we sit down and the very first thing we need to do is address this problem, everybody's focused on the problem, everybody's trying to run out the door. Their brains are anyway, right? So, do these things, don't do these things. I'll let you take a look at those yourself. The book on the left, David Rock, is an easy read. He wrote it in a very fascinating way. Each chapter revolves, there's a married couple, both work professionally, have a couple of kids at home. And every chapter is organized around this couple. There's a scenario that takes place either at home or one of their 2 workplaces at the beginning of the chapter, and things don't go well. Then he introduces some particular neuroscience principles that relate to that situation, and then he replays the situation as it might have happened if the participants had been aware of these SCARF principles and things. So it's an easy read. I highly recommend it. The book on the right, not so much. It's research-based. It's 400 pages. There's a lot of content, and it's fascinating, but it's not an easy read. Other than that, there's some stuff about me. You can find me here. If you want to download a copy of the slides, just these slides, whatever else there is up to these folks. But if you want to download a copy of my slides, you are welcome to. And by all means, send me an email if you have any ideas on this subject, because as you can tell, I hope, I'm kind of intrigued by it. It's fun. It's really interesting to think about what's going on when we're thinking. So, thank you. Do I have time to take a question? I realize I'm eating into your break or preventing you from eating during your break, one or the other, but I just want to see whether anybody has any questions or comments. Yes. It's an interesting point. So if you couldn't hear, he's questioning whether it's consistent that there's very little difference among ethnic groups, but noticeable or at least measurable difference between men and women. Does that mean that having a multicultural group is not important? Absolutely not. And I would not want anyone to walk away thinking that, so I'm glad you asked the question. The reasons for that are quite different from the thinking styles, and that's all probably a whole separate discussion, and I'm absolutely not qualified to lead that discussion. But please don't draw the inference that having a multicultural group is not important just because the thinking styles are so similar across ethnic groups. Anybody else? Yes. Was history more affected by? Yeah, It's a really cool question, and I have no idea whether the A's, the B's, the C's, or the D's have had a stronger role in affecting history. I'd like to think positive changes may be from that partly from that 5%, the people who are truly whole brain thinkers. But great question, I don't know. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Who's exercising control. Could you hear in the back of the room? Partly. So yeah, very, very good point. The fact that people think differently doesn't mean that they will get along well necessarily. So as the manager or leader of a team, you need to be the whole brain thinker, or you need to be the person who recognizes the differences from those who are dominant in one style or another, who are necessary to the final result, but you need them to be able to work together. Yeah. And so that's a tough role. So you may need to be one of those coordinating folks in the middle of all the outlier thinkers. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again.